Hello, hello. NFL video. Today, man, I am making my official Shedeur Sanders situation video. A lot of people have made videos talking about this. I kind of talked about it in my recap of the first round and how Shedeur didn't get drafted. And then I talked about it a little bit more when I was doing my AFC North grades, and I talked about Shedeur and the Browns and that whole situation. But this is my full thoughts on the matter, if you will. Now, before I get into the crux of the video, which is that I do think Shedeur is the answer of the Browns quarterback struggles, I want to kind of break down my thoughts about his fall in the draft and kind of just the way people have been covering it because I've heard different things. The main point that I've heard is people feeling bad for Shedeur. That's the overarching thing, that people feel bad for Shedeur, that he fell as far as he did, and people believe it was unfair and like this shouldn't have happened, which I agree with. There's another argument being that, well, Shedeur clearly just wasn't good enough to be drafted in the first or second round. Now, there was a few people, a minority of people, but a few people who thought Shedeur either now there was a larger group of people who thought Shedeur was not good enough to be drafted in the first round, but he ultimately would because there were so many teams that needed quarterback. Well, not so many teams, four teams were like there was nobody that thought Shedeur was going to fall past the Steelers, at least not that I saw. There was another group of people who were very quiet pre draft, but once Shedeur fell, they started to speak up saying, "Oh well, he clearly just was not good enough to be drafted first or second round." Even if that's what you think, and a lot of people just didn't say that, like there were crickets before the draft about how bad they thought Shedeur was, but they felt the confidence to speak up about it after they saw him fall. But even if you thought that he wasn't good enough to get drafted in the first round, or I guess even the second round, which there is nobody that thought Shedeur would fall to the third, fourth, and certainly not the fifth round, right? So there is a clear disconnect there, I feel like. Now, I feel like two things can be true here. Multiple things can be true. I think one, it is unfair and it is sad, and I do feel bad that Shedeur had to fall as far as he did. But in another case, I do think he kind of brought it onto himself in a couple ways because from all the reports that we've seen, and listen, do I believe all the reports circling Shedeur about his pre-draft process and his interviews are true? No. But do I think where there's smoke, there's fire? Yes, I do believe that Shedeur did not do as well as he should have in the Giants interview. Maybe that was intentionally. Maybe he did not want to go to the Giants for whatever reason. I do think Shedeur approached the draft process with a level of entitlement that is just uncalled for. I mean, if you want to go to the NFL, you have to look at it like a privilege. You have to look at it like nobody here has to draft me. I have to put 110% into the process in the hopes that somebody's going to take a shot on me. I felt like, and I followed this very closely. I followed this from the live streams that Shedeur and his family were doing. I felt like Shedeur knew that he was going to be drafted in the top 10, like without a shadow of a doubt. He was wrong about that. I believe he bet on himself and lost, quite frankly. I think there were certain teams he didn't want to go to. I think he didn't give 100% in certain interviews. And I think he had like a short list of teams, maybe two or three that he had circled. And that backfired on him, certainly. So I do think he has himself to blame for those instances. But when I look at the draft overall, right, he didn't go in the first round. And listen, I do think, notably, the Saints and the Steelers made massive franchise changing mistakes by not drafting Shedeur. Like, I think the Saints drafting Tyler Shuck over Shedeur is going to get Kellen Moore fired in like 2 or 3 years, probably 2 years. I think Mike Tomlin not drafting Shedeur could end up to him not being the coach of the Steelers 2 years from now. I've been very critical of Mike Tomlin in the last few months, and I think all of it's justified. But him pretty much taking Will Howard over Shedeur Sanders is laughable, and it's embarrassing. Um, the Giants trading up for Jackson Dart. I mean, it just seems very clear that Shedeur did not want to go to the Giants. He kind of tanked that interview process. He didn't know, or what's it called? He didn't study the tapes that they sent him, and he was unprepared. All that stuff. That is Shedeur's fault that he did not go to the Giants. And if he would have taken that process more seriously, and if he would have treated it like a privilege rather than a right, then maybe the Giants would have traded back up and drafted him at number 25 or 26 instead of Jackson Dart. But obviously, that didn't happen. The Seahawks drafting Jalen Milroe in the third round. that makes more sense because if you look at the Seahawks perspective, if you're going to draft a guy, if you're going to spend a third round pick on a non position of need like quarterback, you would rather draft a guy who you think, if you develop him correctly, would have the higher potential. I think if everything goes right, nobody has more potential in this draft class than Jalen Milroe. That's just my opinion. That was my opinion going into the draft. So I'm not just saying that because my favorite team drafted him. So I don't mind the Seahawks drafting Jalen Milroe over Shedeur. Um, the Browns. This is one of the most interesting things about this subject. The Browns drafting Dylan Gabriel over Shedeur Sanders. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I think Shedeur had a very short list of teams who he wanted to go to and he thought was going to draft him. I believe those teams were, including but not limited to, the Browns, the Saints, and the Steelers. I believe that his goal, his want, was to get drafted by the Browns at number 2 overall. I think once they traded down to number 5, he still thought they would draft him. They didn't draft him. I think at the top of the second round, I think he expected to be drafted because they had like 2 of the top 5 picks in the second round. They passed on him both times. I think he absolutely expected the Browns to draft him, which tells me, by the way, that he did not tank their interview process like he did with the Giants, for example. I think he gave it his all in those draft interviews, and which is makes it so crazy that when they drafted Dylan Gabriel, the Browns made that decision because they thought Dylan Gabriel was better than Shedeur Sanders, which is just baffling. Because listen, man, you can find even the most staunch Shedeur Sanders haters, and they wouldn't even tell you that Dylan Gabriel is better than Shedeur. And I like Dylan Gabriel. I'm a fan of him. I thought he was amazing. I think Dylan Gabriel has a lot. I talked about this during the Browns draft grades video. I think that Dylan Gabriel had past tense a really good chance to get drafted by a team in the 4th or 5th or 6th round and work his way up and be a backup in this league for a long time. But now, unfortunately for Dylan Gabriel, the Browns made a dumbass decision in drafting him over Shedeur Sanders. And now I think Dylan Gabriel is going to get fucking cut off the roster because the Browns have 5 QBs on their roster, and no team in the league is going to enter the season with 5 QBs. Most don't even enter the league with 4 QBs, but they have the Deshaun Watson situation. So, for some unforeseeable reason, for some reason, the Browns decided to draft Dylan Gabriel over Shedeur Sanders, which makes zero sense. Dylan Gabriel he doesn't have hardly any upside as a franchise QB. He just doesn't. He is too limited in his abilities, in his arm strength, in his size, in his ability. Like it's just he's not good enough. And that hurts to say because I like Dylan Gabriel, but he does not have franchise QB potential. Shedeur Sanders does. Whether you think it's 50%, 30%, 25%, he has it, right? And just these other guys don't have it, I think. So, and what clearly happened, this is an undeniable fact. There is a 0% chance, and I want to clarify this, emphasize this. There is no chance that the Browns GM, the Browns coach, the Browns front office personnel, there is no chance that they were going to draft 2 quarterbacks in this class. When they drafted Dylan Gabriel, they wholeheartedly believed that was the one and only quarterback that they were going to draft. So when they drafted Shedeur at the top of the 5th round, that very clearly tells me that the owner of the Browns stepped in personally and intervened and said, hold on, I may not know that much about football compared to you guys, but I know that Shedeur Sanders is better than Dylan Gabriel, and I want Shedeur Sanders on my team. I have to clarify this. That is the only explanation for the Browns drafting Shedeur Sanders after Dylan Gabriel. That's the only way that makes sense because no GM, no smart GM or coach, because they understand by drafting 2 quarterbacks, one of them is going to get cut. The Browns they wasted a pick, whether it was a 3rd round pick or a 5th round pick. That's to be determined. But they wasted a pick by drafting back-to-back quarterbacks. One of these 2 players is going to get cut unless they trade Kenny Pickett. But we'll get into that. But it was a clear intervention by the owner of the Browns, I believe his name is Jimmy Haslam, to step in and say, we're drafting Shedeur Sanders. I don't care what anybody else says, which is crazy to me because that means the Browns front office didn't want Shedeur. They did not want him, which is just, I think that's a blatant oversight and a condemnation on their ability to evaluate quarterbacks. Because if you really do think, and I don't think they did think, I think they look at Dylan Gabriel as a potential solid backup. To value that over potential franchise quarterback. By the way, when the Browns are in the worst situation in football, they passed on a guy who could potentially be their franchise starter. In the third round, that's a no risk, high reward situation. And they passed on that, which is ridiculous to me. But thankfully, due to the intervention of the Browns owner, they got Shedeur Sanders on their roster. So So that's that portion, right? The Browns owner intervened and got Shedeur on his team against the will of all of his football personnel. This begs the question, is there going to be some sort of friction between Shedeur and all of the Browns coaching staff and front office staff because they didn't want him? I don't know. They were forced to pick him, and now they have to face the reality that he's better than Dylan Gabriel. Because if you let's okay, now let's get into the real main part of this video. Where does Shedeur go for here from here? Because the fact of the matter is, whether or not you think Shedeur was a first round talent or a second round talent, or you think he's asked because he fell in the draft, he's on the Browns. The situation with Shedeur, regardless of what happened during the draft, is exactly what I thought was going to happen. He is now on the Browns roster, regardless of where he was picked. And now we move forward as if he was drafted number 2 overall. You know why? Because the point of drafting him in the first round was to be your franchise quarterback. What if the Jaguars got Travis Hunter in the 6th round, it makes no difference. He's still Travis Hunter. He still has all the talent that he would have had if he was drafted number 2 overall. Shedeur still has all the talent that he had before the draft started. So it's like, it makes no difference to me whether he was drafted in the 1st round or the 5th round. He is now in the position to be the Browns franchise quarterback. That's what I want to get into with this video. People are so enamored by the fact that he fell in the draft. Nobody's really talking about the fact that, hold on a minute, Shedeur is now going to take over the Browns organization as a 5th round pick. That's the story here. So let's get into it now. Let's look at the Browns situation because I've said it before, I'll say it again. The Browns are cursed. The Deshaun Watson trade was the worst trade in NFL history, and they now are physically incapable of winning anything. They cannot make the playoffs. They cannot win a Super Bowl. The Browns are cursed until they can get Deshaun Watson off of their team. But with that being said, this is their depth chart offensively. I don't care about their defense because it doesn't matter. They're not going to win anything. This is their depth chart offensively, and it's bad, right? Obviously. The offensive line was terrible last year. You hope it can get better, but that's not, there's not a lot of optimism there. The wide receiver room is awful. It is terrible. It's arguably the worst in football. And oh, by the way, they did not spend any draft picks on their wide receiver room. You could have spent a 3rd round pick, Dylan Gabriel, and got some really good receivers, but instead you drafted a guy who's probably going to get cut. So, with all that being said, this is the offense. It's bad. Let's look at the quarterback room specifically. Now, for some reason on the depth chart, Shedeur Sanders is starting off as QB4, but here's the thing. He is competing with Dylan Gabriel every day in their rookie mini camp thing. And based on the reports that I have seen from people who have been there every day, Shedeur Sanders is clearly not close. It is not close. Shedeur Sanders is clearly better than Dylan Gabriel. Now, we all knew this. Everybody knew this, except for the Browns for some reason. So, Shedeur Sanders is going to enter their preseason thing, their mandatory training camp, all that. He is going to enter that as their QB3. Okay? So, he's going to be competing for the starting job. Like, guys, it is not out of the realm of possibility for Shedeur to be their day 1 starting quarterback. He is competing for that position with Joe Flacco and Kenny Pickett. Okay? Let's get into that. Joe Flacco, he is QB1 right now on the depth chart. He is 40 years old, and last season he was completely up and down. I mean, depending on what game you saw, played for the Colts last year, of course. And listen, Joe Flacco, he can still push the ball down the field. He's 40 years old, obviously. He's at the end of his rope. But, man, he can still push it downfield. He's not afraid to take shots. He's a risk taker. He's a gunslinger, all of that, right? Which leads to him making a lot of unnecessary mistakes. But the benefit of that is that you don't have to worry about having an offense that's not explosive. Because Flacco, he's going to make explosive plays. He's going to take chances, right? You're going to have a dangerous pass game with Joe Flacco. Dangerous for the other team because you can give up explosive plays. Dangerous for your team because he can turn the ball over at a moment's notice. Now, I point out that he's 40 years old because it is very possible that Joe Flacco simply falls apart next year and gets hurt in minicamp because he's 40 years old and he's not an athletic guy. I mean, if Joe Flacco gets hit the wrong way, he's probably done for the season. I have to throw that out there because I see it as a zero. I see it as a 0% chance that Joe Flacco starts and finishes all 17. Let me just say, a 0% chance he starts all 17 games with the Browns. Because Joe Flacco, by the way, Joe Flacco has, let me be very clear here, he has never played 17 games. He has never played 17 games. And he used to be an Ironman. He used to be an Ironman when he was in Baltimore, right? The last time Joe Flacco played 16, let me clarify. The last time Joe Flacco played 10 or more games was in 2017. That was 8 years ago. Okay. Trying to convince me that Joe Flacco is going to be their starter the whole year, buddy, get off the crack. It's not happening. So the question is not, can Joe Flacco start the whole season? It is, at what point is Joe Flacco not going to be the starter? I am not sure. I do believe if I had to bet money, Joe Flacco is going to start week one as the Browns quarterback. Okay. I feel fairly confident about that because let us not forget in 2023, Flacco, he started 5 games for the Browns. He went 4-1. He was slinging the rock all over the place, and he did look very good in Stefanski's system just 1 year ago. Okay, so that is important, right? He has some familiarity with the system. Not that many players. It's actually been a lot of turnover in the last year for the Browns, but he has some familiarity with the coaching staff, with the system, things like that. So all signs are pointing to Joe Flacco being the Browns' week one starter, unless in the last year or so he is just completely, his body has just withered away. That's possible, but I think he'll be the starter. QB2 at the moment on the depth chart is Kenny Pickett. Now, he was a backup last year for the Eagles. He did nothing. I mean, he just didn't play. So I'm not even going to consider that. Let's look back at 2023 because, by the way, his offense on the Steelers in 2023 is not that far apart from what the Browns have right now. They had one receiver in George Pickens. The Browns have one receiver in Jerry Jeudy. They had a good tight end in Pat Freiermuth. The Browns have a good tight end in David Njoku. The problem is the Steelers had a better group of running backs and I guess offensive line for that matter. The Browns have a bad offensive line, and their best running back is a rookie in Quinshon Judkins. So who knows what that's going to look like? But yeah, Kenny Pickett, as we all know, was not a good quarterback with the Steelers. He was one of the worst quarterbacks in football. He did not turn it over at an incredibly high rate, but he just didn't do anything. He didn't score. He didn't turn it over. He didn't complete passes. He was just pretty useless for the Steelers in the 2 years that he spent there. You know, to be fair to him, he only got 2 years. He didn't even play like 30 games, I don't think. But I mean, it is what it is. He was a bust. With the Steelers, I do not think Kenny Pickett is a very talented quarterback. That's just my personal opinion. The problem is, let me quickly find Kenny Pickett's contract that he signed with the Browns. Because I believe for some reason, some godforsaken reason, the Browns gave Kenny Pickett like a 2-year fully guaranteed contract. Let me see here. According to Sport Track, I'm trying to find this. Sorry, 1 second. Because I do believe the Browns, for some reason, gave him a lot of guaranteed money, which makes no sense. Okay, never mind. I guess not. Maybe I was wrong about that. According to Sport Track, he's not making a whole lot of money. So that's good if that's the case. But yeah. So yeah, quite frankly, this is my personal opinion. I believe Shedeur Sanders is already better than Kenny Pickett. If you had to ask me, if I had one game, if we were playing the Super Bowl tomorrow, would I rather have Kenny Pickett or Shedeur Sanders? I'd rather have Shedeur Sanders. That's just my take. Maybe it's the wrong take. Maybe Kenny Pickett got better in the year that he sat on the bench in Philadelphia. I don't see it that way, but I see no issue for Shedeur Sanders to outplay Kenny Pickett in training camp. That's my opinion. So I believe that Shedeur Sanders, let's look back at this depth chart. I believe that Shedeur is going to enter the season as QB2 waiting behind Joe Flacco. I see it clear as day because as far as I'm concerned, he has already beaten out Dylan Gabriel. It's been a couple of weeks, and it's no fault of Dylan Gabriel. Shedeur is just better than him. It's just he's not going to win that battle, right? So Shedeur is already the Browns QB3, and whether it's preseason or training camp, he is going to beat out Kenny Pickett at some point. Now let's talk before we get to the Shedeur Sanders starting potentially. Who is going to get cut, right? Because the Browns have to move on from either Dylan Gabriel or Kenny Pickett. I don't see anybody making a move to get Dylan Gabriel. Maybe if an injury happens somewhere, I could see a team giving up a sixth or a seventh round pick for Kenny Pickett. So I think the Browns, what I think is going to happen, I had to bet money. The Browns trade Kenny Pickett preseason to somebody for a sixth or seventh round pick to be their backup quarterback, right? Because he's going to get cut on the Browns, either him or Dylan Gabriel. So the Browns enter the season. Joe Flacco QB1, Shedeur QB2, Dylan Gabriel QB3. You just have to look at this offensive group of players, and you can see very clearly it's going to be a bad offense. It was a terrible offense last season. So I already mentioned earlier, the Browns are incapable. They are handicapped by the Deshaun Watson contract. They cannot make the playoffs. They are just not talented enough. So at one point, it would make sense, theoretically, to just start Shedeur day one and just get him as much experience as physically possible. But like I said, I do think Joe Flacco will start the season. So the question is, at what point does Shedeur become the starter? Because I am 100% confident that Shedeur will start games for the Browns before the end of the season. Now, here's the risk. If the Browns are bad enough to where it's possible, very possible, the Browns are the worst team in football next year. They were second worst this year, right? So, I mean, it's very possible that they are so terrible next year that they fire Kevin Stefanski. They get the number one overall pick, and they draft Shedeur's replacement, right? That's entirely possible. But let's say they're treading water, right? Let's say they're a 5 or 6 win team, right? And they're not in the position to get the number one pick. Let's say they draft 5 or 6. When do you start Shedeur? Now, let's assume that Flacco is perfectly healthy. Let's assume that health is not a factor for Joe Flacco at all next season, which is unlikely, but let's assume that that's what's going to happen. And the decision to bench him for Shedeur would be solely based off of his play. Joe Flacco is completely up and down. He is inconsistent at all hell. He could have 400 yards one week and then 150 yards and 3 turnovers the next week. It is night and day. You have no idea what version of Flacco you're getting at this point in time. Just coming off of one of those terrible games is that I think Shedeur is going to have the support from the fan base from day one, right? They are going to want Shedeur to start in week one, right? But at what point does the fan support become so loud and the ownership? Because the Browns owner got Shedeur drafted, so I'm sure he could get him starting if he wanted to. So at what point does the pressure become so big for Stefanski that he feels like he has to start Shedeur Sanders? That's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. It could be week 4. It could be week 8. It could be week 12 because the Browns have no shot of making the playoffs. So it's not going to be like, oh, well, we want to start Shedeur, but, we're 5-4. We're making this playoff push. That's not going to happen. So it could happen at any time. We do not know. But when Shedeur does get the opportunity, I believe that he's going to have his moments. He's going to have his flashes because I think he's a good player. Do I think he was worth the number one overall pick? No. Do I think he was a top 10 caliber player? No. I had a late first round grade on Shedeur Sanders. Okay. So I'm not pretending like he's going to be some superstar in the NFL, especially not on the Browns. But I do think he is going to do enough by the end of next season to where going into 2026, I do think at least the fan base is going to look at Shedeur as the Browns franchise quarterback. And that is an extremely hot take at this moment in time because he's number 4 on the depth chart. Do you realize how much of a length he's going to have to travel to get to that point? But it makes complete sense. I hope I was able to break down in this video the logical steps to where I believe Shedeur is going to end up as the Browns franchise quarterback going into next season. So that's it for this video. I believe in Shedeur. I do think he's going to make the impossible happen and be the starting quarterback from QB4 in the depth chart as a fifth round pick. I do think he's going to overcome the odds. And I think a lot of people are going to have to kind of sit back and admit that they were wrong about Shedeur because there's been a whole lot of hate coming in regards to Shedeur. And I think it was wrong. I think he didn't deserve all of that. But yeah, only time will tell. Unfortunately, we just have to sit back and wait. But leave a like if you enjoyed. There's a lot of ranting. I didn't do a whole lot of preparation, it was just a lot of talking and a lot of explaining. But yeah, leave a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you are new, and I will see all of you on the next one. Peace.